The Air Max 1 is one of Nike's most revolutionary shoes because it was the very first shoe that had visible air unit technology. And it spun off an entire heritage and family tree of air unit technology, visible air units, Air Maxes. And now that they've re-released it as close to the original as possible, I'm curious, is this actually a usable tech? And what I mean by that is there actually pressurized air on the inside? How easy is it to pop? How much air is on the inside? Does it actually do anything if we pop one and leave one non-popped? Is there a noticeable difference? And does it shatter when it gets cold like the originals did? Well, that's what we're gonna find out by cutting this thing in half, run it through the test to find out if the granddad of all air unit technology is actual usable tech or if it's all just been a gimmick from the start. If you're like me, your life is pretty packed. You don't have a whole lot of time for things, and even your hobbies sometimes get sacrificed. And so when a wrench gets thrown in your daily routine, like a car accident, it throws everything off. And not just for that day, but for weeks and weeks at a time. And that's why it's important to know that Morgan & Morgan is America's largest injury law firm with over 100 offices nationwide, 800 lawyers, 4,000 support staff working 24/7, so they can get you taken care of and you can get back to your daily life, because the last thing you want to do after a car accident is deal with all the issues and the legal aspects, the paperwork. And the cool thing about Morgan & Morgan is you can file a claim in 8 clicks or less and from the comfort of your own home, and they have the reputation to back it up. They've recovered over $13 billion for their clients, and most importantly, their fees are free unless they win your case. And there's no upfront fees. So if you're ever injured in an accident, you can check out Morgan & Morgan. All you have to do to get some more information is go to forthepeople.com or dial #law, that's #529. And thanks to Morgan & Morgan for sponsoring this video. And the visible air unit technology has a really interesting story because it all starts in 1978 when a former NASA engineer, Frank Rudy, developed and introduced Nike's air technology in the Air Tailwind shoe. And air technology was a gas-filled urethane pouch inside of the shoe that replaced the classic EVA foam. So the Tailwind was technically the first shoe to have air technology on the inside, but it wasn't visible from the outside. Then in 1981, the world-famous Tinker Hatfield, who's designed all these shoes here, was hired by Nike, but not as a sneaker designer or shoe designer. He was hired as an architect to design buildings for the Nike Oregon campus. Then after working for Nike for a few years, in 1985, Tinker started designing footwear for Nike upon request. And he said, "I began working on a renegade set of shoes that were not part of the design brief or marketing drive, which was greatly influenced by the Pompadour in Paris, a building that took all the structural components of the building that were usually hidden away from view on the inside and walls and everything, and put them right on the outside of the building." And Tinker said, "I thought, let's make the bag a little bit wider and make sure it's stable, but then let's go ahead and remove part of the midsole so you can actually see it." And allegedly, this was a really radical design idea, as Nike thought the visible tech would make the shoe appear weak and structurally unsound in a cheaply made shoe. But with the support of Dave Forland, Nike's director of cushioning innovation, which is an awesome director to be, the very first Air Max shoe was released on March 26, 1987. And one really interesting thing about the initial launch of the Air Max was that for the first few months and about 400,000 sneakers, they had what was called the big bubble. That's because Nike started running into issues with the bubble itself cracking under cold temperature, so they reduced the size of it, and then from then on out, it was a little bit smaller bubble. And since their release, they've become very popular because they've been worn by famous athletes like Michael Jordan, tennis players like John McEnroe, and they're even in a commercial with Beatles' controversial Revolution. They're popular amongst runners, and they became a staple for any streetwear enthusiast. And then finally, fast forward to March 26, 2023, Nike released this very specific throwback on Air Max Day. Nike allegedly used CAT scans of one of the original big bubble shoes of that 400,000 initial release to get the exact dimensions of the air unit correct on this. So that's why we wanted to start this potential Air Max series, if this video does well, with not just the first Air Max, the Air Max 1, but the very, very first Air Max, the big bubble. So what is this shoe? Well, the brand is obviously Nike. The style is the Air Max 1 86 OG Big Bubble. They weigh a pound. The price is $150 and they're made in Vietnam. And before we get to the actual air technology, let's look at the other components of the shoe, specifically the upper, because it is terrible. If you look at this shoe, you might assume it's leather. And if you look at StockX, they call it nubuck and suede. Goat calls it synthetic. On Nike's website, they say nothing. And we put the flame to it, and every single one of these panels is fake leather. And I don't think that's necessarily a horrible thing because they don't advertise it as leather, and synthetic leather has its purposes. It's a little bit more breathable. We put it on the breathability test, it performed just fine. but it's just never gonna be quite as durable, and it's never gonna be nearly as stain resistant as a real slab of leather, especially when Nike throws that big old plastic coat on top. So to me, this is more of like a pajama sneaker, where this is essentially just pajama material. There's not a whole lot to it. Then if we look at the inside of the shoe, really nothing special inside of here, you know, a very basic and really thin insole with a non-woven strobel stitched inside. The collar's lined with a little bit of a softer material, but nothing really special on the inside. And that seems to be the trend of this entire shoe, where everything gets sacrificed and all the emphasis is in the midsole and the air unit. And the thing is, it's not a cheap shoe. It's still 150 bucks. So I was really surprised that there was really nothing else to this shoe than the air unit and midsole. But that is the most interesting part of the shoe, and it is a very revolutionary and historical shoe in the context of sneakers anyway. So now let's start answering these questions of, does this air unit actually do anything? So first, I wanted to just check to see if it was actually pressurized or if it was just stagnant air on the inside. So we grabbed our little pressure gauge, poked it in there, and it read around 10 PSI. So it's clearly pressurized, and that's far from an accurate reading that we can replicate over and over and over again, but at least we know it's more than just ambient air pressure. It is pressurized on the inside. So since we had it popped, we also wanted to see how many pounds it actually takes to puncture through. It only took 31 pounds to puncture through, which was a little bit surprising. I thought it would have taken a little bit more compared to the Scorpion results, but this one is a little bit more protected than the Scorpion because you have the sidewalls and it's recessed into the midsole a little bit more, and you have the rubber outsole protecting it from the bottom. And we also did the outsole puncture test just to see if you were to accidentally step on a nail, if it would completely destroy your air unit. And it took 85.5 pounds to puncture through. So you might not want to be walking around with thumbtacks and nails or glass on the ground just in case, but we'll see when we get it cut in half, but it looks like there's plenty of foam and material between the air unit and the outside of the shoe, so I wouldn't be as stressed about it. But now that we actually have it punctured, we wanted to see what the actual differences are between a punctured air unit and a non-punctured air unit. So the first thing I wanted to test was the responsiveness change between a popped and non-popped. So we did the ball drop test first, and on the non-popped, it bounced up 12.8 inches, and on the popped pair, it bounced up 9.7. And then we did the bar drop test to simulate more of a human's weight, and both bounced up 6.75 inches. So very similar results for a more real-world application. But once we actually put these on and we're walking around, you could feel a very big difference between the non-popped and the popped pair. The popped pair was a lot more squishy, it was a lot more like walking in sand, but it was far from unwearable. So you could definitely wear a pair of these if you got them popped, but you might not want to wear one popped and one not. You might have to puncture both of them to actually make them wearable. And it's not nearly as bad as the Scorpion was, because once that Scorpion was popped, it's as good as dead. Where this has these chambers on the inside that I assume give it some more structural support. So the answer to that question is, if you do pop these, can you still wear them? Yes, you can. And since we might be doing a series on the Air Maxes, we wanted to start calculating how much cubic centimeters of air are on the inside of each of the air units. So we filled up a syringe full of water, and it looks like it's about around 80 cc's of volume on the inside. And then to the one huge flaw that Nike had during the initial release of the Big Bubble Air Maxes was, if you freeze these, will this outside chamber crack if it's too cold outside? So we threw it in the freezer overnight, popped it out, and it still had a little bit of water on the inside. So when we popped it, I thought we cracked it for sure. I thought we were about to have a lot better and more exciting video. But then I realized it was just the water underneath that cracked, and the actual outside barrier still remained intact. So at least after like 40 years, they've solved that problem of these not cracking under extreme cold temperature. So now let's cut these things in half, see if there's anything hidden on the inside that Nike's not showing us, and if there's any corners that they've cut, because they are notorious for doing that, especially with these nostalgic old school sneakers. All right, we got them cut in half, and I want to do a series of Air Maxes and go through the lineage and explain how we started at the Air Max 1 and how the technology evolved and changed and hopefully kept up with the other innovations in the industry, or they didn't. I want to do that series, so if you want to see that, we base what we do off of the success of each video. So if you want to see it, support this video, subscribe, like, all the other stuff to help support the videos. Because if this video flops, we won't do it. So let's see what's inside. I didn't even know there was a second air unit on the inside at the ball of your foot. And so this still definitely has both air units, and we puncture tested the other side to see if there's air in it, and there is pressurized air in there as well. And one thing I really like is how much arch support this shoe has. Because of how big this big bubble is, you get a very high arch drop, which cradles your arch a little bit more. It looks a lot more like what you see in some of those Pacific Northwest logging boots, a very sharp drop down. So that's part of why I think people find these so comfortable, because it's a very supportive shoe. And other than that, there's not a whole lot else in here. You know, it's very basic. You can see the column supporting the air unit. The outsole is a little bit on the thin side. I thought it was gonna be a little bit thicker, but for the most part, it's a very Nike-ish shoe. There's nothing special about it, just very, very Nike through and through, with the whole junk on the outside with being fake leather. So is this actually pressurized? Yes. How easy is it to pop? Around 30 to 40 pounds, but it's in a little window, so it's gonna be pretty tough to do. How much air is in there? 80 cc's. Does this air unit actually do something? It clearly does. Through the test results and through wearing them, there is a difference between a popped pair and a non-popped pair. And does the air unit shatter under extreme cold temperatures? Not at least from a freezer extreme cold temperature. Now to the final question, is this worth that fairly steep price of $150? Well, if you're a sneakerhead and you like the history and the lineage and the story behind it and the concept of being able to wear not just one of the first Air Maxes ever, but the first version of the very first Air Max, the very first 400,000 pairs, it is a cool way to experience Nike history and shoe technology. So I could see how somebody would want to spend the money to own a pair of these. But if you just look at it from a shoe perspective, you take the name away and you remove the hype, there's nothing on the inside here that screams $150, especially if you look at the upper being basically made out of pajama pant material. You know, and keep in mind, the original Air Max didn't have leather paneling either. It was a synthetic material, so you really can't fault them that much for not using leather. And I think you can buy leather versions. But that being said, it is a 40-year-old tech. There's a lot better foams out there that give you more comfort, a lot better uppers that are more durable. So just from a shoe perspective, there's a lot better shoes out there, but I don't think that should necessarily dissuade you from buying a pair of these, because they've actually recreated it fairly accurately, because no one would ever know if they put that air unit in there or not, or if like the air chambers were the exact size and they did the CAT scanning on it and all these different things. So for what it is, I think it's an okay price. And I think it's a cool shoe, and it's a cool story, and it's a cool part of sneaker history. And being able to own a pair is a pretty unique thing to actually feel the history. So let me know what you guys think and your opinion of the Air Maxes and what other Air Maxes you want us to do, because if this video does well, I'd like to do a whole series on it. So support this video and like it, share it, all the other stuff, especially subscribe, because YouTube really cares about that, and so do our sponsors. That's how we afford to buy these shoes and pay for these videos to be edited by our awesome editors and everyone that helps with this. So thank you guys so much for everything you do. And don't forget about the Anvil Builds channel launching on Saturday. You can go pre-subscribe to it if you want. We're gonna do some really cool stuff over there. So thank you guys. See ya.